Here's what's coming up on the program today. The UK believes Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine almost immediately. Nigerian diplomats weigh in on the crisis between Russia and Ukraine and whether Nigerian citizens should evacuate. Plus, Duchess of Cornwall Camilla tests positive for COVID-19. Thanks for staying with us, everyone. I'm Amarachi Ubani in Lagos. To begin with developments out of the Baltic this warm evening. First, the UK's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says Russia could launch an invasion of Ukraine almost immediately. She was addressing broadcasters after chairing a meeting of the government's Emergency Cobra Committee, where she also repeated calls for Britons to leave Ukraine. She says Russian oligarchs and companies would be targeted with severe sanctions if Moscow does invade, but that the UK is still pursuing the path of diplomacy and de-escalation.
We are fully aware that there could be a Russian invasion almost immediately. That is why British citizens do need to leave Ukraine. But we are also pursuing a path of diplomacy and de-escalation. That is why the Prime Minister and I are travelling around Europe this week. That is why we are working to persuade the Russians to remove their troops from the border, because a war would be disastrous.
Our comments come after the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said this morning that Russia is planning an invasion of Ukraine, while Russia denies plans to invade, despite massing hundreds of thousands of soldiers on Ukraine's borders, with 30,000 of them stationed close to the Belarus-Ukraine border. But Russia also wants assurances Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO, though NATO members are opposed to this. Earlier today, we learned Ukraine called for a meeting with Russia and other members of a key European security group over the escalating tensions on its border. Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba says Russia ignored formal requests to explain the buildup of troops and that the next step is requesting a meeting within the next 48 hours for transparency about Russia's plans. Russia has already denied any plans to invade Ukraine, despite the buildup of some 100,000 soldiers on Ukraine's borders, but with the U.S. saying Moscow could begin with aerial bombardments at any time. More than a dozen nations have urged their citizens to leave. As the report on the current crisis going on in the Baltic, while many Western countries are calling on citizens to leave Ukraine now in view of a possible Russian invasion, the Nigerian government is yet to make such calls for evacuations. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs a couple of weeks ago called on Nigerian citizens living in Ukraine to remain calm. And in my interview with him, the Nigerian ambassador to Russia and Belarus, Professor Abdullahi Shehu, said the government is hanging on to the promises of the Russian president that he will not invade Ukraine. I want to begin with you, Ambassador Abdullahi Shehu. International calls for evacuations from Ukraine are growing. You have the US, you have the UK, you have Canada, many Western countries calling for citizens to evacuate. What is the position of the Nigerian government in light of this?
Well, I don't think that Nigeria has made a formal statement with regard to the crisis or the tension in Ukraine. But from the mission's perspective over here, we are calm. We are monitoring the situation. The situation is very calm in Moscow and indeed in Russia. However, as Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, described it, that is hysteria. Well, one could describe it as a storm in a teacup, because it's like one crying and mourning more than the bereaved. We hear a lot of concerns being expressed, but of recent, just yesterday, the Ukrainian government itself advised that we should downplay the news about the tension because it is still being managed diplomatically. I think that there is no cause for alarm. As soon as we see there is any serious problem, we will alert our government accordingly. But for the time being, we want to believe with the statement by the Russian government that it has no intention of attacking or invading Ukraine.
And while African countries may be feeling distance from the crisis in the Baltic, former permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Joe Keshi, says Nigeria could have benefited the most economically from the situation.
I have always been wondering that, look, this is a time that, with all due respect, Nigeria could have benefited immensely if, we had had the common sense to have built the gas pipeline to Europe that was conceived a couple of years ago, and we've done nothing. There's so much gas in this country that we could actually supply Europe in, It's not, I'm not saying this because I see an opportunity for us to make money, but if there were alternative sources of gas to Europe, for example, I can assure you that we'll probably not be having this discussion, because any country that wants to use gas as part of the politics or reasons for going to war or not going to war, we know that there are alternatives. And this is sincerely hope that Nigerian, petroleum authorities will begin to see the need to develop this stretch of pipeline that was conceived years ago. I think it was supposed to run through, Algeria, to Europe or something like that. It is time we begin to give it a second consideration.
You can watch more on the interview with Professor Abdullahi Shehu and Ambassador Joe Keshi on Diplomatic Channel. It airs tonight at 8:30 p.m. on Sky 518 if you're in the UK, and at 11:30 p.m. on DSTV for our viewers here in Nigeria. Just to recap the main story today, which is the UK saying Russia could launch an invasion of Ukraine almost immediately. We heard the UK's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss saying Russia could launch an invasion of Ukraine almost immediately. She was addressing broadcasters where she also emphasized the need for the UK to still pursue the path of diplomacy and de-escalation. Her comments come just after Prime Minister Boris Johnson said this morning Russia is planning an invasion of Ukraine. Though Russia denies plans to invade, it has over 100,000 troops stationed near the Ukraine border. Russia wants assurances Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO, though NATO members are opposed to this. Here's more.
So it's for the ambassador to speak on behalf of his country.
NATO support is coming via countries such as the UK. The country's junior defense minister, James Heappey, said today that Britain will support whatever Ukraine decides to do on its ambition to join NATO.
Absolutely. If Ukraine, as part of its own diplomatic effort to build relationships and confidence with Moscow, wants to offer an alternative route forward that it feels it has chosen as a sovereign country, the UK would delight in supporting Ukraine in that, because we are one of Ukraine's best friends in the world. But if by the same token, Ukraine wants to reserve its right to join NATO or to do something that Moscow disagrees with, that's something that we should support too, because Ukraine is a sovereign country, and sovereign countries should not, must not, be bullied out of choosing what they want to do.
A Ukrainian government spokesperson says that Ukraine's ambition to join NATO are enshrined in its constitution and remain an absolute priority to the country. Earlier, the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, Vadim Pristaiko, was quoted as saying that Ukraine was willing to be flexible over its goal to join the Atlantic Military Alliance, a move Russian President Vladimir Putin says would be a trigger for war. The Kremlin says it does not view comments from the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK as signaling an official change in the country's position on wanting to join NATO. But it says it would significantly help address Russia's security concerns if Kiev did not renounce its intention to become an alliance member. The Ukrainian ambassador later clarified remarks he made about possible dropping a bid for NATO membership, saying the former Soviet Republic would not be reconsidering its attempt to join the military alliance. Asked whether or not Ukraine might reconsider its ambitions to join NATO.
what I told him, that we are not a member of NATO right now. And to avoid war, we are ready for many concessions, and that's what we are doing in our conversations with Russians. But it has nothing to do with NATO, which is enshrined in the Constitution.
Also supporting is Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who arrived in Kyiv to meet with the president on Sunday. He had warned Russia of immediate sanctions and hard reactions if it attacks Ukraine, maintaining a tough tone ahead of a meeting this week with President Vladimir Putin. Russian ally China says its missions and diplomats remain on the ground in Kyiv and continue to work normally while monitoring the situation locally. The country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs says China remains in close contact with Chinese citizens, institutions and enterprises in Ukraine. Meanwhile, residents of the Ukrainian capital shared mixed opinions on the divisive issue of the country's NATO membership. Ukraine is not a NATO member, but has a promise dating from 2008 that it will eventually be given the opportunity to join, a step that would bring the US-led alliance to Russia's border. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Ukraine's growing ties with the alliance could make it a launchpad for the NATO missiles targeted at Russia. He says Russia needs to lay down red lines to prevent that.
We'll have more on the situation in the region as the tensions grow between Russia and Ukraine. Plus, it is Valentine's Day all over the world, even at the Winter Olympics, and that includes the treats despite the games. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're staying with our lead story today. The UK's Foreign Secretary is saying that Russia could launch an invasion of Ukraine almost immediately. The VOA's Jamie Detmer is in Warsaw. Jamie, what are you noticing around there where you are? We know that the US troops have been deployed to Poland as well in preparation for a Russian invasion of Ukraine, the US government promising it will attack Russia if it does invade Ukraine.
We don't have a lot of activity around here at the moment. I saw two military planes, transporter planes at the airport at Warsaw's main airport. But there's a high degree of nervousness here in Poland. Particularly, they're trying to start planning for a possible refugee crisis if there is an invasion by Russia of Ukraine. There's tension in the air, but we're all on this guessing game about what Russia is or is not going to do.
Yeah, and no one's really thinking about the impact, are they? How this will impact neighboring countries. How is this crisis affecting, Poland and all the other countries surrounding Ukraine and Russia? Belarus, for instance, is the launch pad now for Russia, most likely, to begin that attack against Ukraine.
Well, it's one possible launch pad as well. They could come in three different ways. People are trying to plan some eventualities. They're contingency planning here in Warsaw by the Interior Ministry of what they would do if there is a refugee crisis here. People are looking at the implications of a COVID spread as well. If you suddenly get 1 million more refugees from Ukraine, how are you going to test them to see if they are positive for coronavirus? International organizations are discussing this as well. But as I said, we're caught rather in this guessing game, because we don't know how events are going to unfold. What we are seeing, though, is a lot of concerns about what this may mean for NATO generally. After this event, we could well see Western European countries agreeing to increase their own defense expenditure and to position more troops on the eastern flank, countries like Poland, the Baltic states, etc., on a more permanent basis. So if Vladimir Putin thinks that he can push back NATO, if he invades Ukraine, he may see himself having created a situation where NATO ramps up on the eastern flank.
And that's something former U.S. President Donald Trump had called on European countries and NATO countries to do, to pull themselves by the bootstrap and increase their military spending. But let's talk about what Liz Truss, the UK's Foreign Secretary, said about almost immediate invasion of Ukraine. What would that mean? You know, what are your sources telling you about how soon this could happen? I know the U.S. said by Wednesday. What do we believe at this moment?
Well, I mean, Truss was echoing the remarks by senior U.S. administration figures last week. A detailed CIA and Pentagon report was handed over to NATO allies. They seemed to feel that there was enough evidence on the ground to suggest that Russia was very close to the point where it might decide to do a further incursion into Ukraine. People are very divided, though, amongst some of the other NATO allies. France, Italy, Germany are all downplaying the imminence of an attack. As some of your guests earlier were saying, the Ukrainian president has also been trying to downplay the chances that Russia will, in the next day or so, launch an attack, partly because there's considerable damage to the economy of Ukraine at the moment because of these fears. He wants to try to keep Ukrainian morale high and to limit the damage to the economy. So there's a division of opinion about whether this is imminent or not.
We'll just have to wait and see, Jamie, I guess. But thanks for speaking with us on The World Today, and do stay safe, Jamie.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye.
Now, as we move on to other stories, the Duchess of Cornwall has tested positive for COVID-19 and is now in self-isolation. The 74-year-old's result comes days after her husband, the Prince of Wales, tested positive for the virus on Thursday. She, Camilla, had carried out 3 public engagements on that day after testing negative. Prince Charles met the Queen 2 days before that, but a royal source said on Thursday that she was showing no symptoms. There's more in the Global Update.
This will be the first time the Duchess has caught the coronavirus, while Prince Charles has the virus for a second time. On Thursday, the Duchess had described herself as luckily negative during a visit to Thames Valley Partnership in Buckinghamshire, saying of her testing regime, "I've taken it so many times." As well as a visit to Buckinghamshire, the Duchess visited the Haven Paddington Sexual Assault Referral Centre in West London and opened the Nourish Hub Community Kitchen in Shepherd's Bush, where she added the finishing touches to a lubia polo, an Iranian rice dish being offered to refugees. This morning, Clarence House alerted the organisations Camilla visited and the media who covered her engagements. Teenagers in Russia have started receiving jabs of the newly produced Sputnik M vaccine as infection rates in the country have risen sharply. Russia's health ministry announced that a new version of the country's Sputnik vaccine would be made available to a younger age group of 12 to 19 years. Sputnik M has been developed for teenagers by Gamaleya Center. Russia's health ministry registered Sputnik M in late November 2021. Over in Israel, a freedom convoy drove along the main highway linking Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, inspired by protests in Canada against coronavirus restrictions. Protesters carried placards, some stood on overpasses and at intersections on the highway. Protesters carried placards, some stood on overpasses and at intersections on the highway, as the cars, some flying Israeli and Canadian flags, drove by. Outside Parliament, protesters sounded horns and beat drums and called for pandemic restrictions to be lifted. In recent weeks, Israel has rolled back requirements to show proof of vaccination at restaurants, movie theaters, gyms and hotels to coincide with the slowdown in daily infections from the highly contagious Omicron variant of COVID-19. Finally, South Korea's parliament has passed a bill allowing people who have caught the virus to cast their ballot in next month's presidential election. South Korea will elect its next president on March 9, but concerns about potential COVID-related disruptions are growing as daily cases skyrocket due to the spread of the highly infectious Omicron variant. The existing rules effectively ban people diagnosed with a contagious disease after the March 4 to 5 early voting period due to the mandatory isolation policy.
For those who've been waiting, the day is finally here. It's Valentine's Day across the world today. And you know what that means. The endless retinue of love songs playing on the radio, the red and white teddy bears of the supermarkets, and the endless commercials urging shoppers to spend their hard-earned monies on items and experiences that make to make someone, the special someone in their lives feel even more special. The list, of course, is endless, and no other time in the year is the color red seen or worn or used the most, apart from Christmas, of course. And so the special day is celebrated all over the world, including at the Olympics in Beijing, where it's freezing cold at the moment. You'll find pink-colored chocolate flowing from a fountain, heart-shaped lollipops and cake with rose petals for icing. Pastry chef of Nanshali Condotel's restaurant, Wei Zhijian, said he wanted to create a festive atmosphere for his foreign guests. Thousands of athletes, staff and media who entered the COVID-19 protected bubble for the Olympics are expected to adhere to constant mask wearing and social distancing as they completely cut off from the outside world. Persisted only among the bubble, but to try and get them in the mood for love, staff at the restaurant in the city hosting the ski and snowboard events gave desserts at the diner in a buffet of pink and red makeovers. Yeah, and if you love chocolate like me, you'd love this story. Dripping chocolate covers homemade heart-shaped marshmallows at Lilac Chocolate's 9,000 square foot production space in New York City. There it is. 3 days before Valentine's Day on Friday, employees had been busy decorating chocolate hearts with colored sprinkles, dipping cherries in chocolate, and preparing toffee fillings. They're also racing to place chocolates into red and gold boxes for sale online and at the company's 6 retail locations. Valentine's Day is one of the busiest times of the year for Lilac Chocolates. The chocolates have been operating since 1923, will celebrate its 100th anniversary next year. It's what makes what it calls the old school chocolate that's everything made by hand, using the founder's original recipes from the 1920s. The company built up its online business during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, it says it is seeing store sales grow again as tourists and office workers slowly begin to return to Manhattan. And lots of chocolate eating, lots of food and everything. Don't forget to brush your teeth afterwards and just enjoy yourself. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.